So as mentioned, June of last year, June 4th in particular, was literally the worst day of my life. On this day, Apple announced a product called Screen Time, which some of you might use on iOS, which directly competed with my startup that was called Onward, to help people deal with their technology-based addictions. And I'd spent the preceding 3 years raising $3.5 million from venture capitalists and friends and angel investors, recruiting friends of mine from all around the country and the world to come work for me in Los Angeles, going on television and talking about it, really putting my face and my name out attached to this idea. And, it's a really, really painful, shameful experience when something you are so invested in kind of falls apart. And the thing that was really weird is that this was far from my first failure. Okay, so I started my first company when I was 16 years old. From the time I was 16 till now, I'm 45. I've started 6 companies, of which 2 have been successes, which is not a bad hit rate. One is sort of in the middle, let's call it like still surviving, and the other 3 have been huge failures. So you'd think that after 30 years of experience doing something, that it would get easier, as most things seem to do when you exercise a muscle. This did not get easier at all. I was literally 16-year-old Gabe again, like having to lay off an entire group of people. And so I started ruminating, like, okay, if failure is supposed to be such a good teacher, and we're told that failure is a great teacher and it helps us learn, why is it that nobody teaches us to fail better? We never really learn how to fail. We've said a bunch of things about failure, like fail fast, fail often, fail forward, fail up, but what do those things mean? Those things, I don't understand what those things mean, and nobody ever explained them to me. And so I started to dig in, as is my way. My first stop in trying to understand behavioral issues is always the DSM, which is the Bible of psychologists. It explains every disorder and details it. And of course, you will not be surprised to know that there is, in fact, an official DSM diagnosis for somebody with a fear of failure. The word for that is aticophobia. Yay for science. And one of the interesting things about aticophobia is, and the DSM is you get to read the risk factors that might predispose somebody to having a fear of failure. And so here are the official American Psychological Association risk factors for a fear of failure. And they are: number 1, you have a past experience where you failed. Number 2, you've learned to fear failing through various scenarios. And number 3, you're a perfectionist. And when I looked at this list, I thought, this literally describes every high-achieving person I've ever met. There's nobody who doesn't have 2 of these 3 risk factors, which is the minimum requirement for being diagnosed with aticophobia. And so I started to ask, why is it this way? Why have we learned to fail so badly? And, I think it starts very early. It starts in school. I went to a very competitive, aggressive elementary school, academically aggressive. And I remember my teachers telling me literally, do not raise your hand if you do not know the answer. Like, they would really respond negatively. And of course, no matter what, you raise your hand, everybody sees you making a mistake. So it's a very public way of failing. The second thing, which is a little bit more controversial and complicated, is the question of managing the failure narrative, and what we know about failure, what famous people tell us about failure. And so I want to play for you a clip of Steve Jobs. This is a recently unearthed video of him sitting down for an interview with the Silicon Valley Historical Association. And the subject matter is his frequently described first experience as a young entrepreneur, asking Bill Hewlett of Hewlett-Packard to send him some technology in the mail so he could tinker in his garage, which eventually led to a job at Hewlett-Packard, which, as we know the whole story, leads to Apple.
Most people never pick up the phone and call. Most people never ask. And that's what separates sometimes the people that do things from the people that just dream about them. You gotta act. And you've got to be willing to fail. You've got to be willing to crash and burn, with people on the phone, with starting a company, with whatever. If you're afraid of failing, you won't get very far.
So this is the type of failure advice that we are accustomed to receiving, right? This is what famous people typically tell you about failure. What's fascinating about this particular interview is that at this exact moment in time, as he was sitting down for the interview, Next Computer, which was his startup between his 2 stints at Apple, was absolutely falling apart. This is literally that same year that Next is falling apart, that he's at risk of losing the $60 million or so that Ross Perot had given him. The market had basically turned against his ideas. There was not much of a way out. And his advice at this point, instead of the reality of what's it like being in the middle of this kind of scenario right then, his advice was never give up, keep trying, which I think is not very honest. And so it turns out there's also a term of art for this idea when famous people go back and whitewash their previous failures, and it's self-enhancing transmission bias. That's one of the cognitive biases that comes up, and what that means is, in retrospect, you look back at your history and you say, oh, this was no big deal. This failure was a necessary precursor to my success. It was a bump in the road. But that's not how you feel in the moment. That's not where the actual root of that fear of failure comes from. And one of my favorite examples of this is Walt Disney. If you read Walt Disney's official biography, none of the following things I'm about to tell you are included. None of these things are in his official biography. His first startup, called Laugh-O-Grams, failed and went bankrupt. It was his first animation startup. Then he picked up and moved to Los Angeles with nearly a penny to his name, started another animation studio. Its first project, Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, was picked up for distribution, and subsequently the intellectual property was stolen from him by Paramount Pictures, who had a contract that allowed them to take it from him, and he was once again rendered basically penniless. Mickey Mouse was rejected multiple times by film studios before being picked up for production. Fantasia, Pinocchio, and Pollyanna all lost a ton of money when they were released. In fact, each one of them almost bankrupted the Disney Corporation every time he did them. But you wouldn't know that any of this occurred. This is not part of the official Walt Disney bio. And, I think it's important to learn from. The next reason why we're bad at failing is organizational. So I know that you guys here at Zillow have just updated your corporate values, and like most companies, you have values around innovation, risk-taking, appropriateness, all those kinds of things. And one of the interesting things, and it's not about Zillow specifically, because I think you guys do a better job than most companies of living to these values, almost every company has we like to take risks, we like to innovate corporate value. Like, I remember my first job after grad school, I went to work for Cisco. And I remember my boss telling me in the interviews, when they were trying to recruit me, we are an ask for forgiveness, not an ask for permission culture. Some of you may have heard that in other companies. This is literally the biggest load of bullshit I have ever been told. That was like diametrically opposite to the culture that I was working in, like diametrically opposite. And I think all over the place, especially for people who are long-term corporate progressors, you learn that in corporate America, the people who kind of keep their head down, don't stick their neck out too much, don't take a ton of risks, are often the ones with the greatest longevity. They're often the ones, with the 30 years or 40 years of history. And so our organizations are sort of talking out of both sides of their mouth about failure. The other thing that gets in the way of understanding failure really well is this idea, and it's always positioned this way in discourse, that success and failure are mutually opposite states. Something is either a success or a failure in retrospect. And in fact, this is not at all true. And most artists and very successful people in the creative fields will tell you that, in fact, they can coexist really closely to each other. And so I wanted to share a quote. I'm actually going to read this, which I rarely do. I want to share a quote for you from Michael Jordan. He sat down for an interview with Sports Illustrated, and he was asked about his track record. And off the top of his head, he literally knew all these numbers. I've missed over 9,000 shots in my career. I've lost almost 300 games. 26 times I've been trusted to take the game-winning shot, and I missed. I failed over and over and over again in my life, and that is why I succeed. Note, he doesn't use the language that we normally associate with this, which would be, I failed over and over again in my life, and I got back up and tried again and persevered, and therefore I succeeded. He actually understands that failure and success are coexisting states, that if you're really risking something, you're really putting yourself out there, they both exist at the same time. Every day as an entrepreneur, you feel like a failure, and every day you feel like you're a success. They're not, they're inextricably linked to each other. The other thing that often comes up that we think about failure is that the more time we spend learning something, you know, the famous 10,000 hour Malcolm Gladwell thing, which has been debunked extensively, this idea that the more we do something, the more time we spend with a given activity, the less prone we will be to failing, the less likely we will be to fail. But in fact, there's another blind spot that many people end up in, and this is sort of research on the stages of competence, the stages of mastery, by Nickerson et al. And so what happens over time is when you're starting to learn something, whether that's being an entrepreneur, running an organization, being a people manager, whatever it might be, the first phase of your learning is unconscious incompetence. You don't know why you're not good at what you're doing. You're not conscious of why you're not good at it, but you've just started learning something. And the terminal state, the top state, is unconscious competence, and that is the ability to do the thing without really being conscious of why or how you're able to do this thing, right? It's muscle memory is the other analogous way of describing this idea. The problem is, the longer you are unconsciously competent, the less able you are to remember why it is that you were able to become competent in the first place and share that learning with other people. It's called expert bias for a reason. And the idea is that experts have trouble. The more expert they become, the more trouble they have explaining to people just starting out on that cycle how they go step by step to get to the point of being an expert. They gloss it over for various reasons. They forget about it. And so it's a particular thing. And so I thought, okay, what about some organizations? What about some individuals? What about some ideas that embrace failure in a different way? These are all the like social structures that we have to deal with. What about people who've come up with a different way? And so I call this kind of Failosophy, and I want to start by looking at a particular industry that's been in the news a lot lately. And despite recent setbacks in aviation safety, it's hard to remember, unless you're as old as I am, that flying in commercial aircraft used to be really, really dangerous. I grew up in the industry, so I was very conscious of it. In fact, until the 1990s, there was one crash of a Western-built airliner every week on average in the Western world. One injury-producing crash of an aircraft every week in the Western world. Aviation crashes were a normal part of the industry. And then in the 90s, something started to happen. The curve kind of was broken and bent downwards. And now we have many years in which there is not a single injury-related crash of a Western-built aircraft in the Western world. We've had a number of years like that, recent setbacks notwithstanding. And there was a very specific thing that happened in this process that the aviation industry did in order to change this relationship. And it's important because it embraces failure. So the first thing that aviation did was remove the threat of punishment. So it's going to surprise you to hear this. If you're the pilot of an aircraft and your airplane crashes, there is an explicit international treaty that protects you from being arrested. Now, why is it important that you're not arrested immediately after the crash? Because if you feel like you risk arrest, you risk criminal incarceration, the impulse for people is to lie and cover up the incident that immediately preceded that concern. So if you've got this threat of punishment, the first thing that people do is they cover stuff up. So the idea was remove the concept of punishment so that people would be more likely to say, yeah, you know what, this is what happened. This is my assessment of the situation. The second thing that aviation does, which is very different from most industries, is they really train by leaning into failure. So this is a cockpit simulator. Twice a year, commercial pilots have to go and get recertified in the simulator. So what happens when you go into the cockpit simulators, you sit down in this like pretend plane with another pilot, and there's a check pilot behind you, and the simulator operator loads up a simulation for you to fly. But guess what? Every single simulation, every check that you do involves a scenario that you cannot predict that would be deadly if you get it wrong. So every training interaction sets you up to fail. It's not like training where you come in and they're like, okay, you'll just fly on a clear day from SeaTac to SFO. Nothing bad happened. All your engines worked. Like, no, they don't do that, right? The training is explicitly designed to put you in a situation where you might fail. And how often are our training experiences in companies designed to make you fail? Not that often. It's a really different idea. The other elements which are also important, communication is very key. They learned that anybody in the cockpit should be able to question the pilot's authority, because many crashes occurred because the pilot's authority was considered sacrosanct. And so the other people sitting in the room didn't feel like they could say, hey, wait a minute, you're making a mistake. And so that ability to let people say, hey, wait a minute, you're making a mistake, and I want you to look at this again, was an important, really important characteristic. After every single flight taken by a commercial pilot, there is a retrospective. Every single one. They don't only do retrospectives when planes crash. Then they get a different kind of retrospective run by NTSB with trained investigators and a big report that gets written and all this kind of stuff. But every single flight has a little moment where the pilots sit down and they go, okay, how'd this go? What happened? Is there anything we need to write up? Anything that we need to learn? So this constant idea of retrospectives. And finally, and this is one of the things that Boeing is really faulted for, I think, at the moment, is historically the industry agreed to share all safety data with every actor in the industry to try to improve the overall safety of aviation. So if you just think about it for a second, if Delta Airlines figures out some way to be better at maintaining their Boeing aircraft than American Airlines, there is a competitive advantage to Delta withholding that information from American, right? The idea being if their planes crash less, you might book with them more. So they have an incentive to not be transparent. But in fact, in this industry, everyone got together and said, no, we actually have to be totally transparent. If you know that something is wrong, there's a problem, you need to share it with everybody. Everybody needs to know about it immediately. Really different, right? Different approach. Another group of people who are very different are athletes. So similarly to the way that airline pilots train, when you're an athlete, if any of you have done amateur or pro athletics with a coach, one of the things that you know is that when you show up on the ice or wherever it is that you are to be coached, your coach is literally putting you in a situation to fail every single try. So you're not getting to repeat over and over again the plateau of performance that you've managed to achieve. You're constantly being pushed to perform a little bit better. And so coaches basically are designing custom training routines for people that move them just slightly out of their comfort zone each and every time. Just a little bit out of your comfort zone to get you to learn something new. So similarly, in organizations, we could have coaches that help us learn how to fail and take risks. Grit, which we often talk about, this is considered by many researchers, perseverance, the ability to get back up in the face of adversity, is often referenced as being the characteristic of people most likely to produce a successful outcome. However, one of the things that I'm struck by in terms of grit is how much it's the need for grit is a symptom of our bad attitude about failure rather than the solution to the failure problem. And I remember when I was a kid, because my parents were Eastern European Jewish immigrants, I was required to study piano. It's a thing. And so we had a piano, and I had to sit down, and I had to play this piano. And, I had this really, really uptight piano teacher, Mrs. Sabolci. She was very hardcore. We were only allowed to play the conservatory piano, Haydn, Bach, Beethoven, nothing else. And all I wanted to do was play Wham. Okay, so I literally went out and bought sheet music for Wham songs. This is how old I am. I went out and spent my little money to buy sheet music for Wham songs, and I remember bringing it to her and being like, okay, I get it. I've got to do Haydn, but what I really want to do is I really want to play these songs. And she looked at me and with the sternest Hungarian accent said, "This will not happen in my lifetime." And I was like, okay, I guess I'm not going to kill you, so I quit. I quit playing piano. And is the fact that I quit playing piano evidence of the fact that I'm not good at persevering at something? Or is it evidence of the fact that I was able to distinguish at a moment at which I was no longer finding the activity as interesting or as amusing as I would like it to be? And is that actually a problem? Did I do something bad to myself or to my life? We may never know, but I feel like pretty cool and okay with it. It was a good decision. Another thing about learning how to fail well is what are called the Kubler-Ross stages of grief. You guys have heard this before, probably in other places. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And they're the process that everybody goes through in grieving. And one of the things that I realized in the failure of my startup was I went through each one of these phases in a very distinct way. First, I denied that things were going bad. Then I got really angry and frustrated at people. Then I started bargaining, trying to sell my startup to anybody who would buy it. Then I became very depressed. And then eventually I sort of have reached a stage of acceptance about this particular failure. And so one of the things is, if you're not conscious of this, if you're not aware of this, anytime you are going through a failure, you might be surprised at the feelings or emotions that you have. Because these are, not everyone goes through these in the same order, but these are major emotional states, that should not be surprising to you if you're taking risks and failing. Some companies have better attitudes than others. Most of you probably are not familiar with the fact that in 1985, the Coca-Cola Corporation changed the formula for Coke and released a product called New Coke into the market that was not very well received. This is before social media, but literally people went protesting at Coca-Cola headquarters in Atlanta against the release of New Coke. And fairly quickly, Coke withdrew New Coke from the market and replaced it with a product called Coke Classic, which they no longer put on the can, but some of you might remember this Coke Classic was the return to the original Coke. So they often receive plaudits from people about their quick response. So they said, okay, we screwed up, quick response, things got better, we responded to it. But most organizations, when facing such a giant public drubbing, would become very conservative. But Coke did not become very conservative. In fact, the long tail of the beverage business, which you can see in your beverage cooler right here, is a direct result of the New Coke debacle at Coca-Cola. Because from 1985 to 2003, Coke continued to manufacture New Coke, actually. You could buy New Coke from the Coca-Cola company for basically 20 years after its introduction. And the reason for that was Coke did all their research correctly. They did the taste tests. They had the focus groups in. More than 4/5 of people preferred the taste of New Coke. So if they were given a blind taste test, New Coke was more popular than Coke Classic. So they suddenly recognized out of this failure that, they could create a long-tail beverage business in which they manufactured it for a smaller subset of people. And what was in my childhood, you'd go to get a soda at the movie theater and there were like 3 sodas, now has become a explosion of more niche beverages that are targeted at smaller groups of people. And we have New Coke to thank for that. Candy Crush, many of you know, some of you are Candy Crush widows probably in the room. Candy Crush, really popular game. The creator of Candy Crush, they often talk about this. They had 52 failed games prior to Candy Crush's release. And each one of them could have meant the end of the company. But in every case, they had a corporate culture that said, okay, we know these games are not going to succeed. What did we learn? What did work? And they brought that back into the next iteration of the company. Or a completely other way of thinking about it is Alphabet, Google's parent company. So in the last 4 years, Alphabet has killed 46 named products, including companies that were acquired for cash and internal startups that were built. 46 kills in 4 years. And they have a very simple corporate attitude, internal cultural attitude towards these startups, which is if it's not going well, if this product is not working, we kill it and we celebrate the kill. The kill is a thing that we all get together around and say, this is great, we're doing the right thing. The way that Google measures whether or not a product deserves continued support is not by users or revenue, page views, or clicks. It's by how many employees want to work on such a project. So they use the employee participation in innovative projects as an early indicator of whether or not such projects deserve continued support from the company. And if it's not there, they kill them. The drug industry, of course, lots of problems with the drug industry, but I don't know if you guys know this. Fewer than 1% of all drugs developed for Alzheimer's get approval. Fewer than 1%. The failure rate overall in the pharmaceutical industry is 90%. Less than 10% of all drugs submitted to the FDA for approval are eventually approved. It is a very high failure business. If they of course, they make a ton of money, so they're able to absorb failures in a different way. But every industry has the same basic potential relationship to failure. If we innovated at that level of risk in every company, in every organization, the same way that pharma does, think about some of the cool things that we could be developing and building as they are capable of doing. So one of the things that I've done is analyzed a lot of people's really successful individuals and organizations' kind of life stories as they relate to failure. And there seems to be a pattern in terms of phases that people go through that really successful people seem to go through. And I don't know if it's worth trying to model this pattern, but it's definitely a thing that recurs a bunch. So the first thing that successful people often have is they have a moment where they understand what they're interested in doing, who they are, what the vision of their selves is, what they want to be doing with their time. And then they tend to have a naive failure. So it's a failure born out of just that pure excitement to be an artist or a musician or whatever. And then they tend to have a naive failure. Then if they continue to persist, the next thing usually is an early success. So something that then gives them a signal that they want to continue doing this because there is some interesting thing to them. And then usually another setback after that. And finally, a big gamble, which ends up in retrospect being the thing that we're all focused on that paid off for them. So not everybody goes through all of these five, but it's a recurring theme that this particular pattern happens for you, for people. And so what I would encourage you to think about, not model this pattern, but ask yourself whether or not you've allowed yourself to go through these phases of potential loss. Have you opened yourself up to actually failing in a naive fashion at a thing that you're really passionate about and that you care very deeply about? Because many of us, I think we're limited by our ability to embrace the idea that we might fail at it. We have this dream or this vision of ourselves that we don't try. So a few other examples. At Intuit, they give out fail awards every year to the employees. So the best failures of the year receive an award, and they also throw parties every time they try a project and it doesn't work out to celebrate the end of it. Reed Hastings, the founder of Netflix, actually gave a really interesting interview. So he was being asked by CNBC, how you have a tremendous run, you're making so much successful content, aren't you super excited about it? And his response was, oh, it scares me that our success rate is too high. We should be canceling more shows. And the interviewer was like, what do you mean you should be canceling more shows? That's the exact opposite of what most networks would say in response to the success of their products. And he said, if we're not canceling more shows, it means we're not taking risky enough bets on new kinds of content. Our cancellation rate is a KPI that we manage to positively, which is a really unique characteristic of this company, different. And I want to play you a small clip, which I have edited to remove the swear words, but you'll know exactly what they are, from David Chang, who many of you might know as a restaurant entrepreneur, the founder of Momofuku, really, really brilliant, forward-thinking food and beverage industry guy. And here's an interview that he gave with a food podcast about failure.
We have to make mistakes. I wish I was I always marvel at what Will and Daniel do because they're like, this is our plan, this is our agenda, and we have it so detailed out. And I marvel at that ability. I am envious of that ability to execute at that level. That's just not how we do it. We strive to be like that, but we do it in a way that is much more, we have an idea, we try to stick to that idea, but we try to look at all the data and all the customer reaction and all the basically ups that happen, and we adapt, and we're constantly adapting. So for me, I think almost everything we've done has been a failure from the get-go. Then that's just the truth. And I don't think people see that. We have up just about every opening in every restaurant we've ever done. That's not always true. There's a couple here or there, like Sydney, but even then, things were different. And we just grind it out and we figure out how to make it work as we go. And I think that's what makes it a very organic experience for people in Momofuku, and sometimes maddening for people at Momofuku. But to me, I can't see any other way to do it than to like engage with the world, make the mistakes, and pick up the pieces from there, and just get back up and do it again.
So one of the things that Chang talks about a lot is that in Momofuku, in the organization, they hire people for whom the constant F-ups are actually a positive. That's actually something that these people thrive in an environment in which they excel. And the people who don't like that kind of environment, the one in which there are lots of setbacks and lots of frustrations and so on, they kind of get pushed out of the organization. This is not him being falsely humble. This is a legitimate corporate strategy for the Momofuku group and how they hire, recruit, retain, and create a culture. And so, just in sort of conclusion, there's a few things that I would encourage you to do every day in your organization in every way that you possibly can to try to encourage more innovation, more success, and make failure more of a normal part of our lives. And that is, first and foremost, remove the punishment for failure. If you're taking a risk, and I'm not talking about not punishing people who do illegal things or stupid things or things which are inappropriate. I'm talking about people taking appropriate risks. People who take appropriate risks should not be punished for taking a risk. And everybody in an organization needs to participate in making that a reality of the culture. Every single time you get up to try to do something, you should be into the idea of failing at it. That should be your frame of reference. Like, I'm going to do something that's important enough that I might fail at doing this thing. That together you celebrate failures. So when you have things that don't work out professionally, personally, you get together and you say, hey, this is great. This was really cool. Let's open a bottle of champagne. We didn't get where we wanted to go, but I know it's funny, right? Because it's like not how we do it in this culture. I don't mean Zillow, I mean in America, but like we need to do this more because that's how we learn. And do full retrospectives that are open and honest. And the previous 3 items allow that retrospective to occur in an honest and open way. And that's very important. Many organizations will take a failing person or somebody who's like taken risks and failed and exclude them from the company. So cut them out, fire them, get rid of them. If you do that, you lose a lot of the learning about why that particular project did not work out. And if the goal is ultimately to be successful, you want to learn from those failures in detail. This is just an abstract exercise for you all, but today, if you have a moment to think about this question, if you were asked, what is the failure that you're most proud of? It's a weird construction for the question, but just roll with me. If you're asked, what is the failure that you're most proud of? What would you say? What is the thing that you've messed up that you're most proud of? And for me, this is Onward, the company that I started by telling you about. Because I have helped a number of the people, most of the people who worked for me, they've gone on to like better projects and really cool things, and they've taken big leaps up in their professional lives and working on projects of even greater importance. And so I look at that and I say, well, it didn't work out for me, but for the people that I chose to invest in, it's been a really, really productive outcome, and I'm very proud of that. And so I leave you with this one thought, and this is my kind of axiom for living, and hopefully one that will inspire you and enervate you in a way. And I feel like, at any moment in our lives, we should be on the precipice of failure. We should be seeing failure just beyond the horizon. Because if we're not, if you can't identify that state in your career, in your personal life, in your health, in your financial future, then you may not be living to your full potential. Because living to your full potential means having a positive philosophy that helps you succeed. Thank you.
Thanks, that was awesome. So we have time for questions. I'd love to open it up to the folks here in the room in Seattle first, and then we've also got other folks that are calling in through our iPad some questions. So is there anybody here? I can bring let me bring the...
And also feel free to tell me about your favorite failure if you want.
Yeah. Oh God.
If you know.
My question is regarding, we constantly hear about people taking calculated risks instead of just risks in general. How does that philosophy kind of come into your philosophy of risk and failure?
So, so lots of really interesting work has been done in game theory on the question of risk and reward. Various experiments to try to understand how do you balance risk and reward against each other? What is an appropriate level of risk? What is a reward that's appropriate to shoot for, and how do you do that sort of thing? And so one of the things that I will tell you is it's basically an NP problem from a mathematical standpoint, because you can't develop one unifying theory of risk and reward that would work for everybody in every particular situation. So my not knowing what that sort of triggers for you, my general advice and the pattern that I've seen succeed at most of these companies is the risks that you take should be commensurate with the goals and objectives that you and the organization have. So they kind of do exist in a sort of pond in a way that's framed by what it is that you're trying to accomplish in the next realm. And so in that regard, the easiest way of thinking about this is if your big idea for Zillow was making a reusable spacecraft launch company, I would probably say my first reaction would be that may be a little far for the current idea, right? And so it's all about that context. And as you move, or as you're in organizations or groups that have a larger remit, the risk-reward relationship should be larger. So the ELT at Zillow, their risk-reward frame is larger than it might be at the starting level in the company. I think that's normal.
Any other questions?
Hello. You talk about kind of learning how to fail as a child, or kind of being like a deterrent to failure because of a number of reasons. So what are some ways to kind of introduce failure in a healthy way to a child so that they learn how to embrace it at a younger age, take risks, things like that?
Yeah, so a lot of work has been done on this particular topic, and the trends in parenting have really swung. The pendulum has sort of swung both directions in my lifetime. From the best way to drive success in your children is to be really hardcore with them, to everyone gets a participation trophy. And I was the main exponent of this concept called gamification, which you heard about in my bio, and that's the subject of my first 3 books, and I would speak a lot. And people would often, the first question they would have about gamification is, isn't that just giving everyone a participation trophy for everything? Isn't that the core idea behind gamification? And the point that I would always try to make is participation trophies are designed to give people a particular motivational incentive, and that is to show up. So that level of incentive is baked into a participation trophy. Everything that happens after that doesn't work with a participation trophy mindset, because everybody knows that if everyone's getting a prize for this activity, then putting extra effort in to this activity is not worth doing, right? So we have to distinguish between building habits in children and even in adults that set them up for success, and that is showing up, paying attention, taking notes, thinking things through, taking risks, right? And then rewarding them for the specific activities that we are attempting to, or these specific skills that we're attempting to get them to be good at. So, I think it's bad to tell a kid, for example, working on a tough math problem. It's equally bad to tell them oh, the right answer doesn't matter, as it is to tell them you're an idiot for not getting that. Neither of those 2 responses is right in this particular case. And the right response is something like, I'm really glad that you tried. I'm happy that you tried. This answer is incorrect. Let's go back and work on why this answer is incorrect. And the thing is, and it's not a complaint against any educators. Now it's become about kids, this talk, but not to complain against any educators, but what I just described takes a lot more time. That's literally 4 times the amount of time that it takes to do just the simple, you're an idiot, or next, right? Or yeah, nice work, So it takes more time and it's more effort, but the same thing applies to adults and kids. There was a question right back behind you there.
Aside from leading by example, how can individual contributors rewire the way peers, and then particularly managers and leadership, view failure?
So the most important thing, I think, in observing organizations that are successful at creating more innovation by being better at failing is an explicit statement about an intention to take the risk. So not hiding away the fact that you're trying something, so trying to hide it from everyone so that if you fail, you can bury the fact that you failed, but rather being upfront about that and making that part of your personal process, your personal development process, but also your organization's process of saying like, okay, what is our big goal? What is the thing I'm going to try to do? And here's the thing, I'm going to raise my hand and say, I'm going to try to do this thing. And I don't know whether or not it's going to work out, but you know I'm going to try to do it. And if you've played billiards, which I'm sure that you have, you know the difference, but one of the main differences between an amateur game and a professional game in billiards is that in a professional game, many games, the billiard players have to declare where the balls are going to go prior to doing it. So as to control for the risk, the variability of the balls might just go in the hole. When you're an amateur player, you play like any ball in a hole. But as you become a more professional player, you have to say, no, I'm going to put this red ball in this corner pocket and then achieve that thing. And so the same thing holds true, I think, for your professional life and for your career. You need to say, I'm going to take this risk, then you take it, and then you're transparent and open about what happened when you tried it. Sure.
That's over here.
Yay for good questions from Zillow Seattle.
Woohoo! Hello. So would you apply your philosophy to investing too?
Oh.
Like, should we celebrate that Bitcoin got crushed?
Well, listen, yes. I mean, I don't know how else to tell you, but, the risk-reward ratio question, the one about, what the alpha is in a particular stock or other kind of investment, that's an area in which all seasoned investors know that in order to make money, you have to take risks. And so the particular appetite for risk in money investing is based on your ability to lose. That's the first thing that any financial expert will tell you. How much money can you afford to lose? Okay, that amount of money is money you can take a risk with. The money that you can't afford to lose, you cannot take a risk with, or you must take a mild risk with versus a lot of risk. So I think especially in financial investing, the idea that you're going to put some money on red and some money on black has got to be part of the strategy. And it is for I think, most successful people. I know it's tough because you don't want to lose money, but, you have to. And where would we be if people had not taken a flyer on various ideas that were super, super high risk as from an economic standpoint? People got to take risks.
Any other questions? I actually have one.
Yeah.
So in your slide where you were talking about the pilot training, and you had mentioned one of the concepts was to lean in to the failure. I'm just curious if you've had any examples from your past where you leaned into the failure and how it went.
Oh my God, so many. There's so many of them, but they're always really, really complicated. But I'll give you the quick version. So my first successfully exited startup was a company called Trimedia. We found it at the beginning of the previous .com boom, so late 90s. Our mission was to make a consumer-friendly DRM for digital media. So you could share media, for example, on what was then a big deal, which was peer-to-peer networks. And that media could be legitimately shared, but then the creator of the content could earn money for that work. So they could actually sell you products and services. And at that time, the great battle of our era was the recording industry versus the peer-to-peer services, right? Because people were stealing. You remember Napster and LimeWire and all those kinds of things. That was a great battle of the moment. And so we built a product. So our primary focus was in games, but seeing the opportunity and the discussion around the music market, we actually built a product to showcase our technology. And so we released the first track on a peer-to-peer network, in this case Napster, that was authorized by the creator and that had the option to allow Napster listeners to buy the music after a trial period expired. Okay, so we built technology, we rolled that out, we put that in the hands of one musician, and with the San Jose Mercury News covered it, and within a week, I was called down to Los Angeles to meet with all of the leading record executives, every single one. And I remember one very specific meeting, and so I was like, all right, cool, we've solved the peer-to-peer music problem. We solved it. Here's the solution. We solved it. No big deal. And so I went down and I gave this, I was called in, and I remember very specifically going to Universal Music, which was a big company at the time. And they had me come in, and I was like the young techno guy with these like old music industry people. And they put me in a boardroom with 50 people from UMusic and me. And the CTO of UMusic started asking me questions. How's this work? What happened? Da, da, da. And I was all like, yeah, it's like so great. It solves all the problems. And as I was like looking around the room, I realized that nothing I was saying was landing with the people in the room. Not a goddamn thing. They literally were looking at me like I was either crazy or the Antichrist, and they couldn't decide which one. Now, here I am trying to solve a very big problem that they were facing. Their entire industry was being disintermediated, and I'm showing up with a product that could solve this particular problem. And then it became very obvious that they didn't want to solve this particular problem. They were not open to solving this particular problem. And so I had to, in a very public fashion, back away from music. We were a small startup, and we'd invested all this energy in building this music thing. And it became obvious that that wasn't going to happen, and I had to retool. We had to turn the other way and go back to our original focus, which was games. But we burned a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of energy. And I think I kind of sugar-coated that turd in a way at the time by saying like, oh, look at all the big media attention that we received for this particular product. But in reality, we were deathly afraid at that moment that we had wasted a huge amount of time and energy chasing after something where we solved the problem, but nobody cared. And it was really, really frightening. But I have for many years described that as my stroke of genius, when, it was probably anything but.
Any last questions? Anything?
That was such a long story. Thank you for indulging me.
Yeah.
I walked down memory lane.
That's awesome. I want to thank Gabe again for coming into Zillow today to share your insights and your experiences and the concepts of Failosophy. So thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.